Kia ora he uri tēnei o Te Atiawa me Taranaki, ko Alice Tupuna Somerville Lahai. I teach at the Faculty of Māori and Indigenous Studies at the University of Waikato, and one of the great joys of the last 3 years of my life has been a Marsden funded project called Writing the New World, Indigenous Texts 1900 to 1975. The project spends time going all around the region, 1900 to 1975, a period that we actually don't know that much about. We spend a lot of time talking about kind of first adventures and connections with Europeans coming into the region, and we talk about more recent things, but particularly in the area of writing and literary studies, which is my own background. It's kind of like what really happened between, you know, the end of the kind of contact colonial period and Albert Wendt, like what happened in that time in between. Writing the New World has brought together 16 different Indigenous researchers from all around the region with really different backgrounds and different perspectives and different skills. And the podcast is intended to feature their views, their ideas, their experiences, so that you also can have an opportunity to connect with this writing, but also with the region that it comes from. The whole concept of the podcast is so much that happens at universities, really are things that people beyond the university might be interested in hearing about. We're interested in celebrating the writing from this time period, but also celebrating the work of the amazing researchers that have worked on the project. And so we are hopeful that members of their communities and the members of the communities that produce this writing in the first place would find these podcasts to be interesting, and maybe would have them ask some questions and feel interested in knowing a bit more about the writing of their own communities. In order to contribute to the New Zealand Pacific and Māori Language Weeks, in 2020 a special issue of the podcast is being launched with each of those language weeks, featuring people from those language communities speaking about their research in that language.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Tāla whalawa. This is Wanda Ieremia Allen. We have now reached the third of our Taualuga series and the final to the Writing the New World podcast. Thank you all to our contributing members and listeners, and in particular Associate Professor Alice Tupuna Somerville for her leadership, guidance and generosity, which has included many people in this podcast series. In today's podcast, Alice would be talking about the inspiration behind the project and, in summary, the politics and history of writing in the New Zealand literary oceaniascape. Whaftai te lava. Enjoy.
So COVID was a bit of a curveball, obviously, for everyone on the planet. And one of the things that it meant for those of us who are researchers is we had to rethink the way that we designed our projects. I had designed, I planned a lot of conferencing, travel to archives, these kinds of things. Suddenly, that stuff couldn't happen. I'm disappointed about that, of course, but you know, sometimes when you can't do one thing, something else becomes apparent. And actually it was through a few conversations that happened through the lockdown here in New Zealand that this idea emerged of doing a podcast to share some of the insights, to profile the amazing work of some of the researchers, and to kind of make it available to people. People who might be working in the academy, might be working as researchers, might be students, might be community members, might just be interested in listening to some really cool stuff about and what Indigenous people are writing through this period, and what Indigenous people are thinking in 2020. So the podcast emerged as this idea, and for me, this podcast, I've started by talking myself, and now I'm going to turn myself over into the hands of my two amazing master's students connected to the project. So I just want to explain the project included funding for two master's students to be able to do a thesis connected to research and a thesis connected to the project. And one of the things which has been a great source of hilarity and of course for me has been that both of these students actually are working with archives that I can't work with because I don't have the capacity to do that. And also both of them are doing projects that emerge from their own experiences, not just as students and thinkers and speakers of the language, but also their kind of broader whanau experiences, the way they've been raised, the questions that matter to them as people in relation to who they are. So the two amazing students that have kind of been the students on my project, Wanda Ieremia who's the host for this, the other podcast episodes, is a Samoan scholar who had already done a master's, so he managed to wriggle around the wording so that she could get a scholarship to do what's called an MPhil, which is like a second master's on the way to the PhD, and she has just successfully applied to convert that, so now she'll do 2 more years and then she'll pop out with a doctorate on her field. She's working with a Samoan language archive related to the FAKAUE church, and her research has taken her all around the place, both compiling and then engaging with the archive that she's focusing on. Apiata is a Māori researcher who I'd actually gotten to know both of them through sitting in meetings on campus here at Waikato around like student retention activities and things like that. And it turns out that Emin was also heading in the master's direction. Emin is ridiculously multilingual, but he's decided that he's going to focus on some questions of translation around the translation into Te Reo, the retranslation into Te Reo of the Book of Mormon, which happened in the time period of my project, just a couple of decades in from the beginning of the century. And Emin's work, he's actually not just reading in Te Reo, but he's writing in Te Reo. And so one of my joys is that I get to work with another colleague, Hori Manuirirangi, who is doing a kind of joint supervision for me with Emin, because I can talk to Emin about his ideas, but I don't have the skills as a supervisor to provide feedback or engage with him with how he's going to be writing his thesis in Te Reo. For me, I'm excited about these two being my master's students, partly because they totally are examples of what this project has come to be, which is about the limits of my own work and the possibility that can come when we work collaboratively with other people. Both of them have really different discipline training, and for the rest of this podcast they're going to be hitting me with questions, so I'm now going to be interviewed by my own students, and this is the bit I'm quite nervous about, but I'm ready for my first question.
Okay, well my question is, so as someone who is a literary scholar and already had a quite extensive knowledge of Indigenous literature from the region prior to this project, how has sifting through Te Ao Hou for the last 3 years and engaging with literature from the first half of the century, how has that impacted the understanding that you already had of Indigenous literature from the Pacific?
Oh, good question. Yeah, so it has impacted my work. So one of the things about this kind of work, and I really want to overstate, I can't overstate enough how much it's important to me not to be kind of Captain Cooking or Columbusing and being like, I found it first, I'm sticking a flag in it, to quote Eddie Izzard, the fabulous comedian. It's mine now, I possess it because no one's ever thought about it before. The thing is that it was just all gestures, and so I did a presentation once a few years ago at the University of Buffalo where I actually literally showed my different PowerPoint presentations that I had made to students, introducing them to Māori literature over the years. And by then I'd been an academic for about 10 years. In fact, my first couple of PowerPoint presentations were overhead transparency, so that says something exciting about my technological whatever. That was back in the days. The dinosaurs were roaming, and so one of the things that you see, or that I could see, that I could trace, was how much more detail I was able to fill in, right? So my kind of standard PowerPoint called the Firsts of Māori Literature was kind of, you know, sort of filled up a PowerPoint, but it was because like I like had heaps of spaces in it, so that's why it looked really full. I was like, okay, first novel by a man, first novel by a woman, first da 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 da, you know, just. And then I was like, oh, after about a year I'd be doing some research, I'd be like, oh wow, I just found this story by Te Rangi Hiro that's unpublished but is like really, really cool, and it's sitting in his files in Hawaii, and oh, I don't want to not have that in our lineup. Okay, I'll pop that in. Oh, Evelyn Patawa Nathan publishes a book of poetry in 1979. The only Māori poet published, only Māori writer published by the South Pacific Creative Arts Society in Fiji. Comes out in 1979. She's based in Sydney. She refers in the introduction to the collection. 20 years ago, I had a novel that a publishing company in London was going to publish, and it got lost in the mail when they sent it back for corrections. And I was like, oh, okay, so the book doesn't exist on one level, but on another level, I don't want to not have that book on my lineup because it was written, so how, right? Okay, so that'll go in there. Te Auhou got in there at some point. I was like, oh, okay, better go in there. Because people who are like me, who are like literary scholars, you know, we're aware of Te Auhou, we're aware of that stuff, but I hadn't actually spent much time sitting down and reading cover to cover and doing that work. So the gesture has turned into now an engagement. It has made me read contemporary Indigenous writing a little bit differently, but actually more than that, it's made me frustrated with the accounts that we have of Indigenous writing that continue to kind of reproduce this notion of everything started in the 70s. I think they're really dangerous accounts, and I also just think we're missing out on a whole bunch of stuff. This kind of gap of the early to mid 20th century is not just a gap in our thinking around literature, but also around the history of our places, right? I did read this extraordinary quote from someone who said, who shall remain nameless, who said, yeah, in the Cook Islands, there wasn't really anything written until like the 70s. And I was like, really? You can say that about a lot of places, maybe, not really, but especially not about the Cook Islands, right? Like, those people are ridiculous. They have like, you know, Papa Alistair, Tiariki Campbell, Mama Maji, they have Kauraka Kauraka, they have Johnny Frisbee publishing a novel in her teens in the 1940s. I mean, they are like on fire ridiculous, right? So, and yet someone can write in a publication like there was nothing going on. The story of there is nothing going on is a colonial story, yeah? And so it's not that this project is about like going, oh, you're wrong, there was something going on, because I wouldn't really want to waste my life like doing projects to prove colonialism wrong. But one of the things that has really emerged has been the sheer enthusiasm for coming to publication, and people writing letters to the editor, and like engaging, and like, you know, when you read Te Auhou, but also when you read Ngā Mata, a Fiji language newspaper that you know, was published for 100 years, monthly publication for 100 years. No one's ever done a full, you know, analysis of that newspaper yet. So you have all these Indigenous people writing to the editor like, oh, you said this the other day, but what about this? Oh, actually there's another perspective. So there's this Indigenous engagement and thought, and, you know, there can sometimes be a danger, I think particularly with the 20th century, that we kind of don't think about that time period. Because we do talk about the 19th century, maybe the 18th century, and I've done that stuff too, right? You kind of do like the, oh yes, first encounters, the first writer, first Māori to publish something in English was Maui, who wrote in, you know, 1916 in London, and da-da-da, you kind of do that, and then you go, anyway, then there was Patricia Grace, you know, and you kind of do that leap, and you make the gesture, oh, there were these other places, but I feel like the 1970s is more and more an unhelpful kind of starting point for us. I do wonder if we have a particular investment in the 70s as a starting point, because we're interested in telling a story of a Māori Renaissance, which is like, or Samoan coming to independence, or a Hawaiian Renaissance or an Aboriginal Renaissance, right? So we have, in all these different countries, what you have is this kind of story of like, oh, and then all this stuff suddenly happened that was connected to activist work, that was connected to new articulations and kind of demonstrations of independence, of particular kinds of independence and sovereignty and all that stuff. And I think the danger is that we kind of want our writers to emerge from that. And I'm like, oh, maybe that emerges from our writers. Which is not to say you write a poem and a revolution happens next week, although that would be great. I would be so down with that. But it is to say, like, maybe we kind of, a lot of people have been drawing attention to, historians like Aroha Harris drawing attention to the fact there was a lot happening in the 1950s. It wasn't just this period that the boys came back from the war and the ladies wore cool frocks and anyway, then it was the 70s. So I think so I feel quite frustrated now with what feels more and more these kind of colonial stories about what was happening in the time period. And as a literary scholar, I'm really frustrated by the way that there doesn't feel like there's room to have this conversation in literary studies. So modernist studies is like, conventionally in literary studies, modernism was the thing that happened in kind of the first 3, maybe 4 decades of the 20th century, probably the first 3. It's like, oh, and there's like Pound, and there's Joyce, and there's, oh yes, Virginia Woolf, Catherine Mansfield gets to show up there, so we feel very excited in New Zealand because we think we're famous because something happened in London that was connected to us, and so there's kind of this field, and I was like, oh cool, I'll go talk to the modernist, and I'll like be like, hey, like Indigenous modernist, but actually the problem is that people who want to talk about modernism, they're like, oh, modernism is no longer about that time period, it's just like a vibe that seems to happen whenever modernity is connecting with Indigenous blah blah blah. And I'm like, well, that's cool, have your vibe, but like I want to talk about the Indigenous 1930s, like I want to talk about that time. So the periodization in my home discipline of literary studies kind of is being a bit chopped up. I'm not sure that, so New Zealand literature as a kind of frame has been unhelpful because it's been so white, and there hasn't been a move yet that I am very keen to help usher in, a kind of move to thinking that maybe New Zealand literary studies has to include analysis not only of Māori literature but also of Samoan literature, also of Niuean literature, also of Cook Islands literature, not in an appropriative, possessive, like these brownies are ours too sense, but in a sense of if we want to reckon with understanding New Zealand as a place through the early to mid 20th century, we have to understand the kind of colonial and Indigenous to Indigenous dimensions of that place.
I suppose another question I had similar to that was a comment made by Konai Helu Thayman in the 1970s when she talked about that there was a bit of a backlash from Palangi authors in terms of Pacific literature not being good enough. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the reasons behind that and the way and why people completely missed the significance and the value of Pacific and the way that Pacific people were writing?
Yeah, so absolutely. So the reason I had a little giggle when you said these Palangi writers were not thinking it was very good, there's actually so the South Pacific Creative Arts Society kind of emerged really at USP in Fiji in the early 70s. Marjorie Crookham is central to that entity, that phenomenon, which moved into doing publishing of really important anthologies, individual collections, and so on. So what Marjorie Crookham did originally was she went to Pacific Islands Monthly. I'm getting to your question, I'm just going a long way. And she edited like a section, like a few pages each month in Pacific Islands Monthly, which was a very widely distributed kind of secular, general, really white-focused magazine that was published out of Sydney, but was widely distributed around the region. And she was like, hey, can we have like a little section each month that we'll call it mana, and we'll pull together some stuff, and then that's a way that some of our writers can write, and a way that some of our people can then read our stuff. So this is really, really popular and ends up kind of turning into the Mana Annual, kind of a collection, and there are like 3 of them, sort of collections of stuff that have been published in Pacific Islands Monthly. This is in the early 70s, and then it ends up kind of emerging into its own journal, which becomes the Mana Annual, and then it becomes the Mana Journal of Language and Literature, something like that, and that's edited out of USP. Well, at some point, someone decides to have this really helpful conversation, and it was a white scholar who'd been, in Fiji for, good 5 minutes or however long it takes to get opinionated about whatever colony you're in, and he was like, well, just the quality is just really not that great, is it? It's like, sad but true, and oh my goodness, if you want to have a heart attack because you're laughing so hard at the fabulous sovereign audacity of some amazing Indigenous people, you want to see the responses. They have this massive field day. I don't know if this fella packed his bags and went to the airport immediately, but I know that's what I would have done. I would have tried to get a rocket to go to another planet, because I would have just been like, I really did the wrong thing there. Anyway, so there was a really important need to speak back in the 70s. I don't think that need has gone away. But there was a really kind of explicit way that there was stuff going down in that particular colonial context, where you kind of had these, English departments in the region, including New Zealand, have always been bastions of English culture, where people come in and they kind of make these pronouncements about, the local literature, and the local literature is always understood to be kind of simultaneously kind of important / quaint / whatever, for the fact that these people are trying something, but also really, literally terrible, oh my gosh, it's a terrible poem, it's very naive, oh my gosh, that novel, there's no real storyline, it was just that short story, oh my goodness, these people just don't know how to write a short story. So there's a couple of things in there that I think are really important. And I think where Konai is kind of calling this stuff out as stuff that actually continues to be true. You can still read analyses and reviews of books that are not written by people from the dominant culture, or poems or whatever, and there's just kind of a failure to understand what's really happening in that text, and the failure to understand, and this is where white supremacy comes in, doesn't get understood as, maybe I'm not the right person to engage with this text because I'm not really connecting with it. Maybe I'll see if there's someone else who might be, connecting with it. The next move is well, obviously this is a really dumb text. This writer's not a very good writer, right? The craft of writing is something that belongs to certain people, and everyone else is just kind of having a kind of adorable but really ultimately kind of tragic go at writing. This colonial story is something that we see and that we hear a lot about the writing from this period that I'm talking about. So often kind of people will sort of talk about these things and they'll be like, oh well, yes, it's really great they wrote that stuff, but it's only kind of good just because it exists, but not for its on its own kind of merits as literary text. And I think there's a few things to think about. One is people write differently. There are different styles, there are different ways of writing. People still, the dominant culture still prefers to trash the literary or writerly ability of an Indigenous writer, rather than kind of go, maybe this is, and I think the probably a recent example I would give would be the, really deplorable response to Media George's play And What Remains about a decade ago, where people were like, this is ridiculous, this is awful, this play is terrible, it's stupid, it's inconceivable, as opposed to going, this play is speaking out of a logic, not just a politics, yes, a politics, but not just a politics, a logic and a craft and a sensibility and a whakapapa of cultural expression that feels different, yeah? And I'm going to think about that and try and learn to understand that, rather than just that was really dumb. Oh, she's not a very good writer. So one of the things that one of the things that we have to understand is that people are experimenting with writing, and some poems are better poems than others, and the poets themselves might tell you that, but like, oh yeah, that was one of my early works. So part of it is that. But I think a bigger part of it is that a lot of the writing from this period, people are actually drawing on forms of expression as well as not just other than the English literary tradition, right? And so, you know, what we need more and more is people who are familiar with engaging kind of Indigenous literary forms and forms of expression, and being able to draw on that as they engage with then kind of, say, a poem that's written in English or a novel that's written in English or whatever. So part of it is that too, right? There's this other thing going on. Oh, but not just that. We also have like all these like incredible people doing, you know, really experimental things. And one of the things which I kind of really enjoy about this project is just finding this like these really amazing texts that are like incredible texts that are like, you know, take your breath away phrasing, you know, or like kind of conceptually just so deep and fascinating and crazy, and I think one of the dangers always is that if Indigenous texts are not understood as kind of naive and kind of, you know, like really code for dumb people, that the other option is that they're kind of coded as too political. So this is the other kind of way that often Balangi or kind of dominant culture readers will kind of, and critics and that will kind of push something to us like, oh no, that's political. That's just being political, you know, and again, there's a couple of ways of thinking about this. Like, yes, they are. When one is living a highly politicized life, which is the nature of living in a state that is attempting to kill your people, you'll find you might be a little bit political. Like, that's how that goes. But the other thing is that so there's the kind of everything is politics, right? When you're in a press group, like absolutely yes, it's political, but also B, maybe something being political isn't the opposite of it being art, right? So maybe there's a beauty, an aesthetic dimension, a craft, an important form of expression that is connected to politics. And C, maybe it feels political because it's not coming from your point of view. Do you know what I mean? Maybe sitting in high school and being forced to read all of these short stories about white middle class people going to a bach for summer is also a political literature, because just about every single text that I read when I was in English at high school was telling me that my experience of the world was not an experience that deserved to be on the page and was the wrong experience, and an actual New Zealand experience involved, you know, being a man that went to a bach as a kid. So I'd say there's a politics there too.